Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to CSIS this afternoon for what is our latest program on Venezuela. We have a very good group here, and we also have usually more people watching. This program is being streamed live around the country and around the world. The focus of our program today is a new element in the Venezuela crisis, an element that goes beyond the economic, the humanitarian, and the refugee crisis that we've all become familiar with in recent months and years. This is a question of the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro as president of Venezuela. According to the Venezuelan Constitution, a new presidential period will begin on January 10th, 2019. Presidential elections were held in Venezuela on May 20th of this year after having been irregularly rescheduled from their original date in December of this year. By all accounts, these elections were nothing more than show elections, with voter turnout at a record low of around 25%, and with many of those who voted having been drawn to the polls by government handouts of food in a country where we all know hunger is now rampant. These presidential elections were condemned as illegitimate by almost the entire international community, with the exception of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Bolivia. As we approach the date of January 10th, there have been serious international consultations, both within the Lima Group of regional states of Latin America, bilaterally, and in other multilateral fora, including the OAS. What are the implications of this legitimacy issue? To sort this question out more clearly and to discuss where the international community is today, a little more than a month before January 10th, we've brought together an impressive panel here today at CSIS. First, we'll have a distinguished Venezuelan constitutional and administrative law expert and professor of law at the Central University and the Catholic University of Venezuela, Dr. Jose Ignacio Hernandez. Professor Hernandez is currently a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Center for International Development. Next, we'll have the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama, Luis Miguel HINCAPIE. The Vice Minister has also served earlier as Panama's Vice Minister of Government and as Vice Minister of Labor and Development. He's worked for many years as an associate and a partner at the international law firm Morgan & Morgan in Panama City. He has his law degree from Catholic University of Panama, as well as a bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia and an MBA from University of Miami. Next, we will have Ms. CHERYL Urban, who is Canada's Director General for South America and Inter-American Affairs in Global Affairs Canada. In this position, she's overseen Canada's response to the Venezuela crisis, as well as preparations for Prime Minister Trudeau's participation in April in Lima in the Summit of the Americas. She's held many other senior positions in the Global Affairs Ministry, including in the Office of Planning and Management, in the Asian branch, and in Afghanistan. Before joining Global Affairs Canada, Ms. Urban worked for 7 years at the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Ministry of Canada. She has degrees from MIGUEL and from the University of Toronto. Next, we'll have Ambassador PATRICIO TORRES, with whom I had the honor to share the podium a month ago in Santiago during the launch of a CSIS Chilean project on transparency and good governance. Ambassador Torres is the Secretary General for Foreign Policy in the Chilean Foreign Ministry, the third-ranked official in the Foreign Ministry. He has served previously as Chile's ambassador to Japan, as well as to Malaysia and Brunei. He's held positions in Chile's embassy in Berlin and at its mission to the UN. He has a bachelor's degree from Fordham in New York, as well as other advanced studies at City University of New York and Chile's Diplomatic Academy. And finally, moderating the panel, we have our own Americas Program Associate Director and Associate Fellow, Moises Rendon. Moises has directed our Venezuela initiative for the past 2.5 years. He has a law degree from the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Venezuela and a master's degree in law from Georgetown. He's done an amazing amount of innovative writing on blockchain and high technology applications in humanitarian assistance, as well as his frequent writing on all of the elements of the developing crisis in Venezuela. Without further ado, Moises, the panel is yours.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and thank you for the panelists for making the trip from so many parts of the world. We have a fascinating panel today to discuss a very crucial topic, right? And it's amazing the importance of this topic, because it will shape the way how the international community can respond to Venezuela. And again, We're delighted to have 4 different government officials and experts from 4 different countries in the region, so thank you again for being here. But before we get into the discussion, I would like just to take a couple of minutes to put into context, especially for those who are not watching Venezuela as closely, why we're here discussing this, why this time is different, why this matters for the international relations to Venezuela, and how we can respond and think about this issue on Venezuela, right? And it's surrounding this date, this important day, which is January 10th of 2019. And it's about Maduro's legitimacy, right? But Maduro's legitimacy has been challenged since day one. This is not a new issue in Venezuela. This has been an issue since day one when he took office. The difference is that the elections that were taking place in 2013 in Venezuela, they were fraudulent elections. The opposition parties did not recognize them. The opposition leader at that time, Enrique Capriles Radonsky, did not recognize those elections. But despite all of those efforts, despite people being in the protests on the streets in Caracas, Nicolas Maduro was recognized as president of Venezuela by the international community in 2013, and therefore he kept going, and he was acting as a president until today, and until today we have the international community to recognize him as the head of state, right? And the best proof of that is when he came to the UN National and General Assembly on behalf of Venezuela, right? So we have that issue, and that's not the discussion today. We understand that he is being recognized as president and until today, and that's not part of the issue. The issue comes moving forward. We have, as Michael mentioned, a new presidential period starting in January 10th of 2019. These were also fraudulent elections that were not recognized by the political parties like those in 2013, but there are a couple of new elements here. And I want to get into the discussion with Jose Ignacio because he's also going to talk about the legal implications, but there are 2 new elements from my perspective. One is that these new elections that were held in May 20th of this year were also were considered not existent by the National Assembly, the opposition-led National Assembly. And this has very important implications because despite the fact of the results, of the procedures, of the fraudulent nature of the elections, and the National Assembly, the Constitution of Venezuela says, well, this event is like didn't happen. So that has legal implications within the Venezuelan Constitution that didn't have back in 2013. The other element, which is probably the most important one, is that now we have almost 50 countries from the international community not recognizing the results of the presidential election earlier this year. And that's where the strength of this time and the difference of this time of this nature of this issue. And that's what we want to discuss. I mean, what does this mean for Venezuela? What does this mean for the international community? What are the implications of not recognizing Maduro as president of Venezuela? Who will be recognized as president of head of state in Venezuela? How that dynamic might change the nature of how we respond to this crisis. So that's why we're here. We might not have all the answers, but the mission here is to put the issue on the table, put it into the debate, because the date is coming. We have only 6 weeks left, and if you take Christmas, if you consider Christmas and maybe take 2 weeks away from Christmas, we only have about 4 weeks left. So we need to be active and considering and debating this issue. So again, thank you for all the panelists for agreeing to join this panel. This is so important. And with not taking more time, I wanna give the word just for you, for the ones who are interested to learn the structure of the panel. We're gonna have few remarks, 5 to 7 minutes by each of the panelists, and then we're gonna follow up with questions. I'm gonna put a couple of questions first on the table. Then we're going to do another round of questions, and then we're going to open it up for you, for the audience. So be patient. We will get to you, and we will encourage you to participate in the discussion as well. Jose Ignacio, thank you again for being here. We're really excited to have you here. Thank you. So the word is yours.
Thank you so much, Moises. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss a very critical milestone in the Venezuelan crisis, which is the date of January 10th, 2019. I'm going to explain or to present a very brief introduction according to the Venezuelan constitutional law that try to explain why this is a very important date in which is a very complex crisis. Eventually, in the Q&A session, I will be able to address additional issues, but in this initial intervention, I want to just present a brief introduction about this critical issue. Amid an unparalleled political and economic collapse, Venezuela is moving toward a new crisis. On January the 10th, 2018, a new presidential term will begin in Venezuela, and there is not an elected president that can assume the presidency that day. In order to analyze this crisis from a constitutional law perspective, it is necessary to address three issues. First, why a new presidential term will begin in Venezuela on January 10, 2019. Second, why there is not an elected president that can assume the presidency that day. And finally, and in third place, the constitutional consequences of the absence of an elected president that day. Let's start with the very first point. According to Articles 230 and 231 of the Venezuelan Constitution, the president is elected for a 6-year term that begins on January 10 of each term. The current presidential term began in 2013 and consequently will end on January 10, 2019. In 2013, Nicolas Maduro was recognized as elected president by the National Electoral Council in a contested and fraudulent election held on April 14, 2013, after the announcement of President Chavez's death. Despite the frauds that were committed, Maduro's term will end on January 10, 2019. Consequently, that same day, the new presidential term will begin. This is why, on January 10, 2019, a new presidential term will begin according to the Venezuelan constitutional law. Let's move to the second issue. Why there is not an elected president that can assume the presidency that day. According to Article 231 of the Constitution, the elected president must assume the presidency on January 10, 2019 through the oath present at the National Assembly, the Venezuelan Congress. However, there is not an elected president because the process held on May 20, 2018 cannot be considered a legitimate election. On May 20, 2018, a political event to supposedly elect the new president was conducted by the fraudulent and illegitimate National Constituent Assembly. However, this political event cannot be deemed as a legitimate election, at least due to 4 reasons. First, because that event was called and organized by the National Constituent Assembly, that is an illegitimate body with no authority to organize elections according to the Venezuelan Constitution. Second, because that process was organized in a clear violation of several political rights, basically due to the unconstitutional ban declared on the main political parties and also on the main political leaders. Most of them, by the way, are in jail or in exile. Third, because that event violates the principle of transparency during the whole electoral cycle. And finally, because Maduro's regime used the complex humanitarian emergency as a political tool to exercise coercion over the voters. This is why the Venezuelan Congress, as Moises explained, declared such election as non-existent. Also, more than 50 countries decided not to recognize that election. Hence, the event held on May 20, 2018 is nothing more than an unlawful political event that derived from the usurped authority of the National Constituent Assembly that cannot be deemed as an election. Therefore, and according to Article 138 of the Venezuelan Constitution, that event cannot produce any legally binding effects. This is why Nicolas Maduro cannot be considered an elected president, and consequently, there will be not an elected president that can assume the presidency on January 10, 2019. Let's move to the final question. What are the constitutional consequences of this fact? Although there is not a specific provision in the Constitution applicable to this uncommon situation, it can be concluded that on January 10, 2019, the Venezuelan Congress President will become the acting Venezuelan president until a free and transparent election are called. Let me explain why. Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution regulates the presidential line of succession. When the elected president cannot assume the presidency on the first day of the term, the Venezuelan Congress president must assume the presidency in order to assure the continuity of the government. Precisely, this solution can apply to the present case because there will not be an elected president on January the 10th, 2019. However, Article 233 of the Constitution is intended to apply under normal institutional conditions in which the rule of law assures the enforcement of the Venezuelan Congress decision. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Venezuela. Since the installation of the fraudulent National Constituent Assembly in 2017, rule of law was dismantled in Venezuela, and the Congress does not have any actual powers to enforce its decisions. Precisely, this is why the support of the international community will be a necessary condition to assure the enforcement of the Venezuelan Congress decision in order to appoint the Venezuelan Congress as acting Venezuelan presidency. Additionally, this implies that the international community must recognize the Venezuelan Congress as the only institution with direct democratic legitimacy, even to represent Venezuela internationally, according to the principle of the responsibility to protect. In conclusion, due to the absence of a legitimate presidential election, Maduro cannot be recognized as an elected president and will not be able to assume the presidency on January 10, 2019. As a result, the Venezuelan Congress president will become the acting president until a new, fair, and transparent election will be organized by the legitimate authorities. This could be the first step to restore the rule of law and the democratic order in Venezuela, and also the first step to reveal the fragile state capability of Venezuela, again, with the strong support of the international community based on the responsibility to protect principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Luis Miguel, thank you again for being here. We really appreciate it. The floor is yours, and then we're going to come into questions. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm going to try to explain the position of Panama, the historical position of Panama within the framework of the problem in Venezuela. It's important to point out that, and I think it's very important to point out that Panama's previous government broke diplomatic ties with Venezuela, with the Nicolas Maduro government. In fact, my first task as a deputy minister was to reestablish those diplomatic relations. Our position with Venezuela has always been, and with everyone else, has always been of constant political dialogue. I think it's important to stress that. We have insisted with this position through this administration, and have even been criticized of being a little bit soft with this position. Panama, even with the intervention of President Varela, made possible the participation of the Vatican within the dialogue between important actors of Venezuela political scene. We have always believed that the solution should be within Venezuela. However, the international, as has been pointed out, the international community must play an important role putting pressure with the different measures to try to solve the problem. Now to the Lima Group. We have joined the Lima Group and have been a key player throughout the period. The group, as you may know, has been created to, as a group, seek an alternative and put pressure on Venezuela's government for a solution to the problem. However, sometimes we have felt that actions within the group have been left to be taken only by a number of countries. For example, Panama, we agreed at some point that to impose financial sanctions, and Panama was the only country that did it, igniting a bilateral crisis within Panama and Venezuela. I don't know if you remember that Maduro's government imposed commercial sanctions on Panama's airline, Copa, and stopped the flights from a couple of weeks from Panama to Venezuela and backwards. We still believe that the Lima Group could play a key role on solving the Venezuelan situation, but we have to see the position new governments will take again to see what's going to happen within the group. Aside from the group, Panama has tried bilaterally to seek alternatives to get a dialogue established, and has helped the Venezuelan people, the real victims of the problem, to make life a little bit easier. We have keep insisting to the Venezuelan opposition that they must need to do more than just denounce the government. They should form a unified coalition, not act separately, which is sometimes that has made the dialogue difficult. Now, I would like to stress the actual situation, what we're here for. Panama and the Lima Group has declared that if elections were carried out, that in fact they did, without the proper and minimum warranties for an election, they would not recognize the results. To that effect, Panama and other countries did not recognize the results. Therefore, the government that is about to take office will not be recognized by Panama or any other of the Lima Group members. Now, what repercussions legally has the non-recognition of a government? First, there is no test or doctrine that imposes irrefutably or inequivocably, when it comes to recognizing a government or not. You have Mexico's position of the Estrada Doctrine that claims that foreign governments should not judge positively or negatively the government or changes in government of other states, as such actions will imply a breach of state autonomy. This doctrine is based in the principle of no intervention and self-determination of nations. The same could be said by the Tobar Doctrine or La Raeta Doctrine. Basically, both doctrines do not recognize de facto governments emerge from coup d'etat, non-free elections, etc., etc. Then we have the Betancourt Doctrine, which was proclaimed by the Venezuelan President Romulo Betancourt, which says that the government should not be recognized if they are not born out of popular expression through the only legitimate way of power, free elections. In most cases, but in most cases, government recognitions are based in realpolitik, which is politics or diplomacy based primarily on consideration of current circumstances and factors rather than ideological consideration. I believe that Panama falls under both a political and legal decision. Panama has a decree from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where rules are established for the non-recognition of governments emerged from coup d'etat, electoral fraud, and also from elections or governments emerged from non-free election. And this is basically the Betancourt Doctrine. Now, this is the legal framework, but we have established already that there is no real or legitimate way to decide this. There has been many governments emerged from these situations, and Panama and other governments have kept their recognitions. However, in Venezuela's case, we have already said that we will not recognize the upcoming government based on the non-legitimate elections. So what are the next steps? There are many possibilities, diplomatically, commercial, legal, etc. Possibly the suspension or break of diplomatic ties, or reduce them to a minimum. In the end, in our case, we have many Venezuelans living in Panama, and so this decision will make them the victims and the ones who are going to suffer on the decision. Expelling the ambassador from Panama. We have no ambassador as we speak in Venezuela. We have a charge of affairs. Not allowing government officials to go to Panama or transit through Panama. Freeze assets of government officials. Establish list of individuals from financial institutions not to operate with these individuals. Not supporting the so-called dialogues called by the government as he has proven that this is to gain some time. So these are just some of the possibilities, diplomatic, political, and financial, that Panama or any other state can take as measure against the Venezuelan government. Trying to look into the future, the first thing to point out is that the illegitimacy of a government will not be resolved with the passing of time. Even less when that government maintains exactly the same conditions of political exclusion that originated. The causes and crises since then have aggravated. If the causes of illegitimacy remain, the validity of the Declaration of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of June 2018 will remain even more valid. That resolution contains the only possible pacific solution to the crisis. One, a dialogue between all parties, and two, new elections with real conditions for all. Any other option will be a continuation to prolong the crisis and to repeat the same experiences we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis Miguel. Thank you, CHERYL. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it, and thank you again. The floor is yours. That's
great. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important issue. I'll just start off by saying that for the government of Canada, the crisis in Venezuela is one of our foreign policy priorities. This is a crisis that's a political crisis, it's a human rights crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's becoming a regional crisis, even a security regional crisis. Canada opposes the Maduro dictatorship, and we stand by Venezuelans. The other thing that is behind and drives our commitment to working on this issue is that Canada, in all of its foreign policy around the world, is wanting to make sure that we champion universal values, and those values include democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We've been working closely with our partners in the hemisphere, our like-minded countries, including through the Lima Group. We're a founding member of the Lima Group. And we feel that the Lima Group has played an important role and will continue to play an important role. Canada, our foreign minister, hosted the third meeting of the Lima Group in Toronto last year in October. And we'll continue to work with our Lima Group partners. Along with the Lima Group, we recognize the legitimacy of the National Assembly, and we reject the authority of the Constituent Assembly. I'd like to just take a little bit of time to talk about some of the actions that the Government of Canada has taken over the past year and a half. Some of these actions have just been independently that Canada's taken on its own, and some of them have been together with Lima Group members. I've talked about our membership in the Lima Group. The other thing that we've done is that Canada has had 3 rounds of targeted sanctions, and that's against 70 individuals of the Maduro regime. Those sanctions include travel bans, asset freezes, and financial prohibition. They're based on abuses in terms of human rights and corruption and democratic governance. The other thing that Canada has done is that we were one of the countries that was party to a joint referral to of the situation in Venezuela to the International Criminal Court. And this was after the OAS SecGen's panel report on crimes against humanity in Venezuela. I would also note that our former Minister of Justice, Professor Irwin Cotler, was a member of that panel. We've been very vocal and very publicly vocal about the situation in Venezuela and making sure that all of the abuses that are taking place are that this is called out. There's been over 40 statements that have been made publicly. That's including our minister, that's including leaders. It's part of multilateral organizations and just Canada itself. And we will continue to be very vocal and outspoken on this issue. The other thing is that we've supported resolutions. Specifically, we've supported resolutions at the OAS on the situation in Venezuela and at the UN Human Rights Commission. I'd also add that we've downgraded our diplomatic relations. So just to get to the point of the specific topic of this panel about January 10th, which I agree is a very important milestone. When it comes to Canadian foreign policy, Canada recognizes states and not governments. So what that means for Canada is that for us, this isn't a question of whether we recognize the presidency, but rather this is a question of how Canada will conduct relations with the state of Venezuela. We do believe that January 10th marks the beginning of an illegitimate term. And we have, along with our Lima Group, other countries declared that the elections that took place in May were fraudulent and have rejected the results of those elections. I'd like to expand a little bit about what are those downgraded diplomatic relationships. First of all, similarly, for Canada, we do not have an ambassador in Caracas. We haven't had one in Caracas since the summer of 2017. As well, in Ottawa, in Canada, there is not a Venezuelan ambassador. Some may recall that our chargé d'affaires was declared persona non grata in December of 2017, and Canada undertook reciprocal measures in that regard. Another aspect of our downgraded relationships is that we have a ban on support to Venezuelan candidates to multilateral and international organizations. We also have a ban on formal bilateral military cooperation. And government officials from Canada cannot attend events in Venezuela or hosted by Venezuela. And similarly, we have restricted the issuance of invitations in Canada and by Canada to Venezuelan officials. It doesn't end at that in terms of the future of how Canada will undertake measures with regard to Venezuela. So we're in dialogue with partners and the international community about other ways in which the Maduro regime can be pressured. A couple of general remarks on moving forward. When it comes to the January 10th, we'll look to work with our Lima Group partners and see if we can arrive at a unified response to the January 10th. And the general policy for the Government of Canada when it comes to addressing the crisis in Venezuela is, in some regards, I would say, kind of four-pronged approach. The first one is what I talked about political pressure, and there are a number of different avenues for us to exert that pressure along with partners. Those public statements that call out abuses, sanctions, and building support among countries, and hopefully growing international support against what's happening in Venezuela. The second is that we are also focused on helping to build the conditions for negotiations, because Canada is of a view that the ultimate goal is a restoration of democracy in Venezuela, and that the best way to do that is through peaceful negotiations. Thirdly, we support Venezuelans and support the people. And it's very clear right now that Venezuelans are suffering, and the migrant population and Venezuelan migrants are also suffering very deeply. Sometimes it's disturbing, upsetting to even think about it on an individual basis. And Canada provides humanitarian assistance for Venezuelans and is working with the region, because I think that what's most appropriate here is a regional response to a regional humanitarian issue. So we'll continue very much to focus on this, which is a growing concern. And then finally, in the event in the future where there is a transition, it's important as well that we focus on ensuring that the international community and that Venezuela is well prepared for what comes next. A final point on that, the resolution to this crisis must come from Venezuelans. And we also will be looking to guidance from those to whom Venezuela has identified as their legitimate representatives about how we move forward, especially post-January 10th. So I'll leave it at that for myself, and thank you very much.
Thank you, CHERYL. Thank you so much. Ambassador Torres, thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate it. I know you came from Santiago, so thank you for taking the time. The floor is yours. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me say first that, of course, we don't need to identify a lot of issues to know that there is a profound crisis in Venezuela, political, economical, humanitarian crisis. The political crisis, I think, is illustrated best by the clash between the National Assembly and the so-called Constitutional Assembly, and the taking away of the powers, of the legitimate powers of the National Assembly. Then the economic crisis, of course, if you look at the projections by IMF, if you look at the debt being regarded as an impartial default, if you look at the inflation, which the numbers are really mind-boggling, it's obvious that there is a big economic crisis. Then the humanitarian crisis, I think, is best illustrated by the reports of the Pan American Health Organization, which are really worrying. And from then, I think the humanitarian crisis, let me say that, today is the most pressing issue. It doesn't mean that we do not consider the political solution and the end of the economic crisis as important, but the humanitarian crisis is really, really something that worries us. I was talking this morning with our ambassador to the OAS, who visited Colombia, Cucuta, a few days ago, and he was describing to me what they saw over there, and that is really should be a priority for us. Let me say that for Chile, the objectives of course, of our action regarding Venezuela are for the democratic institutions to work normally, the rule of law to be reinstated, human rights to be guaranteed, and the solution to the crisis through a peaceful political dialogue. Peaceful and credible political dialogue, I would say. We are, of course, members of the Lima Group, and as such, we have accompanied the statements of the Lima Group, and we have enacted all of the Lima Group's recommendations. We have no ambassador in Caracas, we have a chargé d'affaires, and we have an embassy with diplomatic career colleagues that are working there on a daily basis. We have consulates in Caracas, and we have a very active diplomatic mission, I would say. We also have worked at the OAS level. We have had already, I think this year, more than 1, 2, 3 resolutions at the OAS concerning the situation in Venezuela. We also have participated very actively at the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council has adopted important resolutions. The latest one calling Venezuela to cooperate with the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And as my Canadian colleague mentioned, we also sent a letter to the International Criminal Court to investigate possible gross violations of human rights in accordance to a report by the High Commissioner on Human Rights, as well as an independent panel of the OAS. Chile has granted asylum to 5 judges, members of the Tribunal Supremo de Justicia of Venezuela, which are currently residing in Chile. And also we have 2 high-profile political leaders as guests in our embassy in Caracas. One of them is Freddy Guevara, and the other one is Roberto Enriquez. And we have, a number of Venezuelan refugees in Chile. Perhaps the numbers are not so big as the case of Colombia, Ecuador, or Peru, but it's getting close to 200,000 Venezuelans living in Chile. We have enacted we're in the process of a migration reform in Chile. And as part of that migration reform, and as part of the regularization process for migrants and refugees, we have enacted the so-called democratic responsibility visas for Venezuelans. And already we have, in the few months that this has been in place, we have about 70,000 requests for these visas, and we have already granted about 15,000 of them. So there is a lot of interest in the visa. Will allow the person who has it to go to Chile, to stay there for 1 year, work there, and then they can apply for 1 more year, and then you pass on to the permanent resident status. This is part of having, not only for Venezuelans, but for all refugees. We have almost 1 million migrants in Chile out of 18 million inhabitants. So we need to have an orderly, safe, and regular migration. We have participated in regional as well as Lima Group meetings on Venezuelan migration. And we are dealing with this with the most urgency, how to have some collective action, some harmony between the measures that we all take regarding the migration of Venezuelans. I think it's very important that we request international organizations to come into helping the countries that have hosted large numbers of refugees from Venezuela, and that their basic services are being pressed too much by the influx of Venezuelan refugees. So I think there is something there that the international organizations can do more. We have said, together with 11 members of the Lima Group recently in September, that we do not believe in a military intervention or violent solution to the Venezuelan crisis. We think that there must be some sort of credible dialogue in order to have a peaceful resolution of the crisis. We also have rejected violence, regardless of its origin, in Venezuela. What happens after January 10th? Well, we think the Lima Group should have some sort of unity and collective action. We must agree on sending some signal and making some actions, credible actions, after January 10th. There are many options. My Panamanian colleague spoke about some of them. In the case of the Lima Group, as such, we have not made any decision yet. There may be some meetings at national coordinators levels or perhaps higher up to decide what we do. But I think the important is that we have some sort of uniformity in how we deal with it. I think we need to express very clearly our belief in the illegitimacy of these May elections and what is going to happen after January 10th. But I don't wish to advance any particular decision on the part of Chile because we are yet considering all our options. We have to look for a wider picture in the case of Chile. We have the two high-level, high-profile political guests in our embassy. We have the case of a well-known journalist who was arrested and now is under house arrest for covering demonstrations. We have 16,000 Chileans in Venezuela. And we have, as a priority, the need to show the Venezuelans Democrats that we stand by them. I would stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, everybody, again. I think we have been following Venezuelan crisis for a while now. And it seems that Venezuela is always running out of options. And we have sanctions, we have negotiations and dialogue attempts. We have diplomatic efforts, we have multilateral, bilateral efforts, and it hasn't worked yet. The situation continues to get worse, and it will only get worse much quicker now, as the speakers were mentioning. The migration refugee crisis creating an overwhelming impact in the region. So this is why I think that the January 10th, and that's why we're hosting this type of discussions, brings kind of a new light or a new opportunity. It opens the door to think out of the box and to see what else can be done, again, both to increase pressure on a regime that is illegitimate now, but also to alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelan people. So, and that's where I'm gonna put a question on the table for everybody in the panel. And again, this is not a question directly to any particular country. I think it's actually better to just keep it broad from the international community perspective. So that's why I'm putting this broad question, and it's a very simple one. If the international community chooses to challenge Maduro to continue in his office, or based on the Canadian foreign policy, change the nature of the relationship with the state, what can be done by the international community? And we have a commentary out, and we listed 5 options, right? And I encourage you to take it if you didn't see it on the registration table. And I'm gonna just briefly read them and open for the discussion. And if you have any other options, I know some of you mentioned some actions, but I wanna put the actions on the table because those are the specific items that we can discuss, we can debate. So the first one was suspend accreditation of Venezuelans' current ambassadors and send them home. I think Panama is kind of more down the road already. Panama already made some important decisions in that regard, but other countries not. So what are the implications of not having only Panama, but having maybe almost 50 countries doing that type of action? There is a difference there. The second action is recognize the legitimacy of the elected National Assembly and the Supreme Court in exile, which hasn't happened yet. As some of them mentioned, the Supreme Court in exile is functioning. We have judges, 5 of them residing in Chile, and I think some of them are residing in Colombia. It's not a fully conglomerate Supreme Court as we have in the Venezuelan Constitution, but is operating and is making decisions. And those decisions are being backed by the OEA's General Secretary, Luis Almagro, and I think having countries in the region debating what to do about those decisions is important as well. So that's the second option. Third option that we have in the commentaries, recognizing the previous rulings of the Supreme Court in exile. Again, it's connected to that issue. 4th item, prohibit any further international agreements with the Maduro regime. Is this feasible under the foreign policy of each of your countries? If it's not Maduro the right person to negotiate, who will that be? Would that be the National Assembly, as Jose Ignacio was pointed out? Fifth, refuses visas to members of the Venezuelan regime. And in fact, in the event of illicit activities, prepare for detention and prosecution. Is this feasible from your perspective? And you know, when we published this commentary, we got a very good feedback from the thing. I don't want to call him out because I didn't ask him about it, but I know many of you know because he lives in Washington, he's a thinker. And he said, well, Moises, great commentary, but you know what? I think you left out the most important action that the international community can do post-January 10th. And that is, and I quote, prohibit payments to entities under the control of the Maduro regime. For example, PDVSA. So is that an item that is on the table as well? And that's where, you know, this is where the January 10th issue kind of brings the options and opens the door and force us to think out of the box here. And so I'm putting all of those items in the question. I would love to hear some reactions to any or all of these items. I know there are more actions that can be considered, and I would love to hear if there are others and get feedback from you.
Well, if you allow me to go first, I think it's important to point out that, and I don't know if all of the Lima Group members have formally removed their ambassadors from Venezuela. I know they have, or most of us have called out in consultations, the ambassador, and have not sent them out back to Venezuela. So that's a de facto move. That's something that you have to see legally. But we have not, from Panama's standpoint, we have not legally yet removed the ambassador from Venezuela. That could happen after January 10th, and probably that's going to happen with many of the Lima Group members. So I don't know if Chile and Canada have legally and diplomatically actually removed the ambassador from, but I know that the last meeting of the Lima Group that I went, we agreed that we were going to call on the ambassadors in consultation.
Right.
Consulta. I don't know how to say it in English, sorry. In consulta. So I think that's a possibility after January 10. Another possibility, and something that I criticize a lot, is that we cannot only keep signing comunicados. Again, I don't know how to translate that into English, but we have to take real actions against the Maduro regime if we are actually going to do that. And I put example of what Panama did with the list. The list was based on Canada and U.S. list, and no other country from the Lima Group did a move like Panama because the arguments were that they legally couldn't do it. But we found a way to do it, so we invited other countries to do the same thing. But I think we have to move, and one thing that you mentioned is that we can have multilateral banks, for example, stop giving loans to Venezuela. There are a lot of possibilities that can be done in order to close the door on Venezuela. That's the only way to pressure the government or the regime to make some changes. Well, I don't see any other way to do it but to keep pressuring and make them sit in a table with the opposition. The opposition has to be unified also, because that was also a criticism that the other members, other state members of the Lima Group did. Who is the leader of the opposition? Who is going to take the lead on? You have many people talking about leadership and talking about being the real leaders of the opposition, that we didn't have a clear picture of who the real person was to that. So the opposition has to play a key role. They have to agree on being together, and then they can sit down with the opposition. Because remember, in the dialogue, so-called dialogue that took place in the Dominican Republic, you have only a part of the opposition sitting there at the table. the other part of the opposition was saying that the dialogue was not, I don't know, truthful because they were not there. So these are things that are possibilities that you can or countries can do to pressure the Maduro government to sit at the table, because I see that I have heard that, of course, the military intervention is not a possibility. So the only possibility is to have a dialogue and have elections further in the year in the coming months.
Yes. No. Thank you. Yes, please.
So maybe I'll just continue in the same spirit. I think that Canada's perspective is very much of the same spirit, and Canada has called, just along with other Lima Group members, for the full powers of the National Assembly to be fully restored. So let's repeat that. And so some of the examples that you provided, as I've already described, Canada has already undertaken. But I do want to point also that another element that came out in a Lima Group statement was that legal acts requiring authorization of the National Assembly will only be acknowledged as legitimate once approved by the National Assembly. So I thought I would lay that out there. Canada does have engagement with the National Assembly, especially through our embassy in Caracas, and we look to continue and to maintain our engagement with the National Assembly as we move forward. I would just add that, there's kind of a bigger question to what you were raising, is what more can the international community do? Because a lot of us are feeling very frustrated that there's been a real significant interest and want to see things change. And I would argue that certainly with a lot of us in the hemisphere, there's been a really good effort put forward to do everything that we feel like we can in order to make that change, and yet many are feeling frustrated that this goal is eluding us. But that's all the more reason to continue. And there are things that we can continue to do. I think additional countries can show support for the referral letter to the International Criminal Court. That's one example. The UN Human Rights Council will be starting its report, and so countries can work with the UN Human Rights Council on that report. And also, High Commissioner Bachelet has been invited to visit Venezuela. So I think that we can also apply pressure to make sure that visit is meaningful if it takes place. I already mentioned the Canadian sanctions. We're not alone. There's been the United States, the EU, Switzerland, Panama, who have also had sanctions, and it's a good departure point for others to join. And if we can broaden that and get more in the international community and broaden that amount of pressure, I think that's a good tactic. At the same time as the importance of addressing the migration crisis and the humanitarian crisis, which is very significant.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ambassador, yes.
Yeah, well, true. There is a long list of options open. Some of them have been mentioned here, some others we can think of. For Chile, we are looking at them from two perspectives. One is that we want a Lima group that acts united and collectively as much as possible. And second, our own particular situation, which I explained, the Chilean residents there, the need to be in contact with the opposition and the guests that we have in our ambassador's residence, etc. So we are still considering from these two perspectives what to do, and we will of course reach a decision within the Lima group and if necessary also individually. With respect to what my Panamanian colleague asked, whether we had ambassadors accredited, Chile doesn't have an ambassador accredited in Caracas. The former ambassador ended his tour of duty, he returned, and then we never requested for any other ambassador to be received.
Great, thanks. Let me put another issue on the table. I think it's important to address it too, which is, maybe Maduro will not be recognized as the head of state for many countries, but that leaves a vacuum, right? That leaves a void that needs to be filled. Someone else needs to represent Venezuela, someone else needs to speak on behalf of Venezuela. I think Luis Miguel mentioned an important point about the multilateral representation, and I was just talking yesterday with another expert. And there is a legal term in here that is important, and I would love to hear your thoughts, Jose Ignacio, which every country that sits in a board in a multilateral institution needs to be duly authorized to speak on behalf of that country. after January 10th, that opens the possibility that Maduro, for example, sitting in the Venezuela, sitting in the board of any multilateral institution, will not have that duly authorization anymore. So there are legal implications moving forward, and I think that's important. But my question is let's put an ideal scenario here, and I know the frustration is there, and we all share it because we all trying to help, and it's the opposition, right, and the Venezuelan society more broadly. Let's say that we have an ideal scenario, that the opposition gets together by January 10th. And let's say that the National Assembly served that vehicle to kind of convey unity in the opposition and in the society more broadly. There are many issues going on currently, and there are many things, many scandals going on, but I think there is still a possibility that that scenario happens. If that happens, if we have unity, if we have a National Assembly, which is the only legitimate democratic institution left in Venezuela, assuming the role of the head of state moving forward after January 10th, how will the international community respond, or how should respond, and what type of relationship should have the international community with that new head of state, which in this case will be the National Assembly? So that's one question maybe for the government officials. And for you, Jose Ignacio, is there any alternative to the National Assembly? Is there anything else that Venezuela can do to assume that important role after January 10th? Is the Supreme Court in exile legitimate enough to assume that role? Is a government backed by the Venezuelan people's, a new government, a new representation, a new organization can assume that role? So that question is to you too. Feel free to jump in.
Well, again, I'll go first. I don't know. I don't know, because you will have a situation that probably you wouldn't have anywhere else. You will have some countries not recognizing the government, but then you will have countries recognizing the government. So I don't know. You will have two head of states, two people who will serve on seats in multilateral organisms. So it's very difficult. I would like to hear from a legal standpoint from the expert, but really, and I don't know my colleagues from the other governments, from Chile and Canada, but it's a very difficult situation to point out as we speak, because you will have countries recognizing the government, and then you will have a number of us not recognizing the new Maduro regime. So imagine if in somewhere like the UN Assembly having the National Assembly represented, and then the government represented. Who will be the head of the delegation, for example? It's very difficult to point out when you have the situation of having various governments recognizing someone that you don't recognize. So something like that. I don't know.
Thank you for the thoughts.
Very difficult.
Yeah, well, and let me first say also there's aspects of that scenario that this idea of a really strong and unified opposition that's nice to think about, and eventually we may end up in a position, and that would be really great. But it is difficult to respond from a public policy perspective and foreign policy perspective to scenarios like that, because there's a lot of implications, including legal implications. So I can only fall back to some of what I had already said about Canada's position about recognizing states and not governments. But as well, just to also underline again that we do look to guidance from those who are legitimate representatives of the Venezuelan people for guidance about what, how they should best organize and how we move forward.
Thank you, CHERYL. Yeah, Ambassador.
Yeah, I think that, it's also part of the picture. What are we going to do? Are we going to recognize someone else or some other mechanism or institution? Of course. And the National Assembly has been mentioned, and the Tribunal Supremo Legítimo has been mentioned also. But this is a part, it has many implications. My Canadian colleague also mentioned for some countries, there is the doctrine of the recognition of states and not governments. So you would have different reactions of like-minded countries on this issue. I think it's part of the broader decision-making that we have to do at national level and also Grupo de Lima. So I wouldn't go further on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Jose Ignacio, you have the last question on my side, and then we're going to open it up.
Yes, a very good question. It is necessary to consider that the political problem, crisis in Venezuela, cannot be solved just applying the Constitution. Because as I explained, there is not such a thing as a rule of law in Venezuela. And this is why I think that the complexity of the Venezuelan problem should be addressed with an open mind, considering that a strict application of the Constitution, unfortunately, will be not enough. So what will happen if, for any reason, the National Assembly decided not to fill this vacancy and appoint an acting president? Can the Tribunal Supremo de Justicia Legítimo, the legitimate Supreme Tribunal, fill that absence? If we understand that the judge appointed by the National Assembly can exercise the authorities of the Supreme Tribunal, it's necessary to consider that according to this set of competences of the Supreme Tribunal, it cannot fill the vacancy of the presidency, basically because this is a political decision, according to the Constitution, but mainly a political decision. This is why, according to the Constitution, the institution with the direct legitimacy to fill this vacancy should be the National Assembly. And if, for any reason, if the National Assembly decided not to fill this vacancy or cannot fill this vacancy, well, we're going to have a serious problem in Venezuela because the lack of legitimacy of Maduro, for sure, will increase the Venezuelan collapse and the collapse of the state capability.
Okay, so so the National Assembly is the only institution so far that we have to rely on this issue then, moving forward. There's no alternative from your perspective.
Again, considering that this is a political problem that should be solved at the extent of the possibility, according to the Constitution, there is no plan B in that case, unfortunately.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, you have been very patient. I want to call the Ambassador Brownfield. I know you're being very patient and you have to go earlier too. So just say your name very quick. I know many of you know you, and then maybe Pedro right behind you. We're going to take 2 questions every round. Yes, Ambassador.
Will you protect me? Will you protect me if, am I to stand? If Pedro attacks me based upon what I'm about to say? Having said that, I am Bill Brownfield. I am a senior fellow at CSIS.
Great.
I'll say nothing about my compensation status. It's beginning to embarrass me. I listened carefully, and by the way, with complete agreement, to our Canadian representative when she noted, I think she used the word frustration in terms of whether the Lima Group has been able to come up with new ideas and new approaches recently. I'm not sure you actually said frustration, but the sense was it would be nice if there were some other ideas out there. And in fact, we've just talked through one of those, and that is January 10th, and how to use that in some way as an opportunity. May I offer 3 more for this excellent panel and see if that provokes any sort of reaction or comment. 1, the diaspora. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the Venezuelan diaspora of the last decade, a couple of 100,000 maximum, located mostly around Madrid in Spain and South Florida in the United States. This is 4 million, perhaps more, Venezuelan citizens spread around 20 or 30 different countries. Are there possibilities? Is there an opportunity to organize? Can they communicate? Can they coordinate? Can they establish more or less permanent bodies that might be in a position to express views or even facilitate things inside Venezuela? Because I also agree, after pounding on this wall of a unified opposition with accepted leadership, I mean, I was doing this, ladies and gents, back in 2004, 2005 in Caracas. Perhaps we should accept that's not going to happen right now. Is the diaspora another opportunity to work that problem set? 2, humanitarian assistance. Everyone in the world has to acknowledge this is the hemisphere's worst, and perhaps one of the 2 or 3 worst humanitarian crises in the world today. Is there a way to operationalize that to the extent of having the international community In its smallest context, the Lima Group countries, larger context, OAS and the hemisphere, broadest context, global, basically saying we are prepared to move humanitarian assistance in through a couple of different locations. The recipient and distributor would have to be someone other than the government. Is this a way to basically push the ball further down the field rather than continue to talk generically about the issue? And finally, number 3, new governments. May I remind you that there is a government in Bogota that has been in office now for about 3.5 months, and a new government in Brasilia, which is due to arrive, I think, in about 5 days. And yes, to acknowledge the grumpy pessimism of our Chilean colleague, there will be yet another government arriving in Mexico in another 5 days, which may or may not offer the same sort of opportunity. But do the new governments, particularly of countries that share long borders and strong commercial interest with Venezuela, have the possibility of offering opportunities? Humanitarian, diaspora, new governments. I am done.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Hand the microphone.
That's
Pedro Ureli from Venezuela. Bill, I'm going to, after that magnificent intervention, I'm going to continue to insist that you get paid for all that you do for CSIS. Well, I first want to thank the 3 countries that are represented here. I think you should add the fact that you're here to the activities that you're doing. I think it is very important that you come and talk about an issue that's very pertinent, very timely, but it's also, getting deeper into the internal affairs of a very troubled neighbor. So I think it's very important that you're sitting in this room. I just wanted to ask you if you think that frustration that you've been going through, and I think the Declaration of Toronto was particularly an incredibly powerful declaration, and when you look at it a year later, it has to produce frustration, is that we might be making the wrong diagnostic. And that at the end of the day, we're trying to find political solutions to deal with a government that is a criminal government, and that all the evidence of that actually exists. I mean, the people that Panama and Canada have been sanctioning are actually being sanctioned for criminal activity. A lot of it for narcotics and corruption. So is the Lima Group truly organized, staffed, or talking about how to deal with a criminal state and not just with a political crisis? Because I think part of the frustration is that you have in the room people who are diplomats and they're trying to find a diplomatic, peaceful, constitutional solution. But I'm not sure that that's a problem that we have. And I would like you to address this issue, because I think we have 3 examples in the region of drug people, big drug organizations that were taken down. One was Pablo Escobar, the other is Noriega in Panama, and the other one is El Chapo Guzman in Mexico. And I think none of them were brought down by diplomats. I think it's when you actually have a narco state, and the first narco state in the region, you might actually have to think that there's a different solution, because in reality, it was not something that looked like the group of Lima that took down those 3 individuals.
Thank you, Pedro. Let's get to those questions. I think that we have enough on the table, and then we're gonna open another round. Okay? Yes.
I'll go first again.
Ah, yeah.
Seniority or age, or age over seniority. Well, I'm gonna just point out the humanitarian aspect of the question, because I think the other aspect has been already been taken care of. As I am aware, the humanitarian help has been available to Venezuela in many ways. And I speak for Panama. We have just inaugurated a humanitarian center in Panama, which is available to all the countries. From there, the help has been available. I don't think Venezuelan government has been aware of the problem. They have not recognized the humanitarian crisis. They have not recognized the humanitarian crisis. That has avoided the possibility of having humanitarian help in Venezuela. And I think, and I know that many countries from the Lima Group have discussed this option, but And I think I'm not mistaken if I say that I think the Red Cross has tried to get into Venezuela, and the Venezuela government has opposed to that, and probably many other humanitarian help has been unable to get into Venezuela because the government doesn't recognize that there's a crisis. Everyone else knows that there's a crisis except the Venezuelan government, and that's difficult. But believe me that the intention of helping Venezuela is there. Again, we have just inaugurated a humanitarian hub to help the region. We can help anyone that asks for help, that needs it. We know that Venezuela right now is the biggest problem, and the biggest problem is now the how to say medicina, medical aid, because we have been seeing some enfermedades, illnesses that have disappeared now appear again, for example, in Colombia, in Chile, in Ecuador. So this is it's very worrisome that this is happening now. But again, I know that the humanitarian help has been there available, but it's been difficult to provide it to Venezuela in Venezuela because of the government. And the other question about the Lima group, I agree. We've been trying to get the group to recognize something else to do different from the diplomatic aspect. But again, we tried to convene the ministers of finance to do something about the list, for example, as we did, and Canada and the US has done, but we have been unable to do so. And now we have to see what happens after the new governments take office. Mexico, for example, Brazil and Colombia, I know some of them have very strong opinions on what's going on, but we haven't met after this. Well, Brazil is about to take office in I think January 1st. Mexico is in about a couple of days, and Colombia has been very vocal after they took office. But we have to sit down in the Lima group to see other possibilities other than the diplomatic. But I think we all have ruled out the military intervention. I think I think for now that it's a no-no.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I'm going to not take offense to the comment about diplomats, but you know what I like about both sets of questions, and I always get this impression when I come to Washington, is that despite the complexity of the crisis and what a big challenge it is, I always hear people looking for opportunities. That discussion never stops. And I think that just is an indication of how important this issue is to a lot of people and how people are seized with this. I will just say, I think it's good to say that the Lima Group also has had tangible outcomes and successes, and I'll just point to one. Maduro was disinvited to the Summit of the Americas that took place earlier this year. And the Lima Group played a very important role in helping to facilitate the disinvitation. So I think that the Lima Group has been successful in isolating the Maduro regime and in isolating Maduro. It's just one example, but I think that there are successes that you can point to in the recent past. Some of the ideas that I liked that were put forward was this idea of working with diaspora, and it also reminds me, something I haven't mentioned about Canada's approach is that one of the things that we make sure that we do is engage with civil society and engage with diaspora, and I think that it's really important to do so, and I also agree that by adding more emphasis on that, it could create more opportunities for us. On humanitarian assistance, we call on Venezuela and on the Maduro regime to recognize this as a crisis and to accept international assistance and accept help. Canada is providing international assistance. We have $2.2 million for Venezuelans in Colombia and in Venezuela, and then in addition to that, $4 million that we've had in the past year, that's been for a regional fund, then a lot of that benefits Venezuelan migrants. We also, on the margins of UNGA in September, we co-hosted a meeting with Colombia about the migration crisis. And there we were talking about what can we do in the future, because this is a regional issue and requires a regional response, and Canada is going to continue to follow up on that. I agree as well with new governments. Canada is going to be reaching out to these governments on a whole broad range of foreign policy issues, and Venezuela will be an important one. So I think that looking at it from the lens of opportunity is really important. On the issue of criminality, just to end on that one, sanctions are one way that we can get at addressing criminality, because some of those sanctions are for corruption and abuses in corruption. And so that's one way. As well, we have had finance ministers invited to Lima Group meetings, and there are sometimes Lima Group meetings that lead to more technical level of discussions. And I think that there's more opportunity to continue doing that, to broaden that, because I'm actually very much in agreement. I think many people are, that this doesn't just rest in the domain of diplomacy, that it needs to also branch out to other areas.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add? Yes.
Briefly, I think on the question of the frustration existing because of the actions by the Lima Group, which are very difficult to pinpoint, and to pinpoint their effectivity or not, because they're on the political level, most of them. I think, yeah, of course, if you measure, the tragedy for many people in Venezuela because of the crisis, and then you see these countries trying to enact actions that seem somehow rhetorical sometimes, too rhetorical and not too much into practice. Then you see, of course, this brings about frustration. But let me tell you, what we do work seriously within the Lima Group. Every time we meet, we follow up, we make recommendations each country, we consider them together, we meet. We are trying permanently to be practical. That's at least my experience in the last 2 years, or the year and a half I've been involved with this. We are trying very hard to be practical and to keep in mind that there is a human face to all this crisis, and that's very important. On the question of the changes within the Lima Group, Ambassador Brownfield referred to that, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, it's too early to tell. We don't know. We're trying to find out what is going to be their position, which way they are going. There are some hints, of what could happen, but there is no way we can be pessimistic, optimistic, a point here or there. We have to wait and see. One of the governments have only 3-4 months in power, and the other ones have yet to inaugurate. So, yes, and on the humanitarian thing, yeah, of course, we could do more. International organizations could do more. I remember a case early on in Chile. The Venezuelan community put together a big aid package and some shipments, and together with the Red Cross, they were sent to Venezuela, and they were not allowed in the country because supposedly there was no humanitarian or no crisis, and then it rotted down. Finally, on the diaspora, in Chile, we have, because we have so many Venezuelans, there are a lot of groups, organized groups, and we keep contact with them, the foreign ministry. And of course, if you think about the millions that are out there, they could make a difference if they unite and work a little bit more together. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador. Briefly on the humanitarian assistance, and that's more than a question, it's something to think about. Again, January 10th is the turning point for a new government. What if that new government represented by the National Assembly accepts and calls for humanitarian assistance? Yes. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Doing a time check, we have 5 minutes. Unfortunately, we have to finish on time, and some of the speakers need to get a flight. So I will ask you to spend no more a minute to do the question briefly, and then hopefully we have 2 minutes to respond. I know I have 2 questions on Gustavo Herbert. Let's do Gustavo Herbert briefly, and then one here, and then maybe one woman over there. Yeah, Mia.
I am Gustavo Tarre. I am with the CSIS. There is a date as important as January the 10th, which is January 4th. Why? Following the interpretation of Professor Hernandez, which I share, in this day, the National Assembly convenes, and the first point in the agenda will be the election of the new speaker.
Yeah.
This election, January the 4th, if the legal interpretation of Professor Hernandez is right, and I think it is, will be the next acting president of Venezuela. On January the 10th, the problem that Deputy Foreign Minister HINCAPIE pointed that who is the leader of the opposition, or is there a person to deal with? But we will have an acting president, and this acting president will be an opposition leader. But this acting president on January 10th will be in jail, or perhaps a guest, a new guest in the Chilean embassy or another embassy.
Or in that side,
and that's a problem that the international community has to deal with. It's not only the illegitimacy of Maduro, but the fact that the legitimate acting president will be in jail.
Thank you, Gustavo. Yeah, briefly, Herbert.
Yes, first I want to point out that January 10th is important for the political and constitutional reason that has been explained, but also we should expect that by then the humanitarian crisis that is developing will be much, much worse than it is today, because the crisis is intensifying by the minute. My question to you is this. In terms of, for the Lima Group, in terms of trying to bring on board other actors, other countries that are either neutral or actively supporting the government and engaging them into some type of discussion, for example, Russia, China, even Cuba. Those countries have a very strong interest in the region now. And so the region, the countries of the region have some power in terms of discussing with them what they are doing in the region, and particularly in the case of Venezuela. So is there anything that you can think of or elaborate in terms of how this opportunity can be used to engage into dialogue and discussion, negotiation, whatever you want to name it, with those countries, and trying to, again, at least neutralize them or to have them in a more favorable position to a change in Venezuela?
Thank you. Yes, let's do one here, Mia. Yes, okay. On the one, yes, let's grab that quick.
So
yeah.
Paula Chufro with the Atlantic Council. Just to follow up on the humanitarian assistance point, there has been some reporting over the last 24, 48 hours that Maduro has in fact accepted UN or requested UN support, humanitarian assistance, specifically on the health front. So I wonder how that factors in or affects how you're thinking about the January 10th. Obviously, there'll be, from a humanitarian standpoint, it's a very positive development. Question is, how does that affect the kind of pressure campaign on the sanctions front, and how that's perceived and factored in terms of the public support for Maduro and pressure internally?
Thank you. Well, we have 2 minutes. If you want to take briefly 30 seconds.
Okay. The Lima Group is open to anyone. I mean, we have been inviting countries to attend meetings. For Spain, the last meeting in Mexico, Spain was present. I believe was Mexico. I don't remember the country exactly, but it's open to countries. The problem will be to engage countries that recognize the government. That will pose some problems. So it's very difficult to know that who else will be part of the Lima Group if they have the intention to be part of the Lima Group if they recognize the government. That's for that question. For the humanitarian, I don't think it's changed anything. The non-recognition of the government, it doesn't have to do anything with humanitarian crisis or the humanitarian aid that Maduro has requested. I think we have all expressed our concern about the way that the elections took place. We have expressed that our intentions of not recognizing the government because of the election. So I think the political has to be separated from the humanitarian. We all recognize that the humanitarian crisis is happening in Venezuela. I applaud that Maduro finally has called upon assistance, but that I don't think that changes anything on the political side.
Thank you. Last word. Sure, Cheryl.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'm going to agree on the separation between the political and the humanitarian. I think that the 9.2 million is a good development, and I mean, although if you look at the scale of need, it's much, much greater than 9.2 million. So hopefully that's a good sign of things to come. And in engaging with other countries, that's a possibility of, I think that part of the approach going forward has to be broader engagement internationally, right across the board.
Nothing to add.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you again for the panelists for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you.